Welcome to the Judaism From Within podcast. I'm Simi, Lerner. So continuing our journey through the mitzvahs of the Torah through the lens of Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch through his work HOREB. This week we are going to discuss the idea of natira, resentment. It's an idea that comes up in Leviticus, in Vayikra, and this week's discussion in HOREB, to refrain from resentment. Now, this is a religious calling. What do I mean by that? Rav Hirsch puts it in its correct context, gives it its due weight. And this is going to be the focus of this week's discussion, the religious context of bearing a grudge. The reason I say this, Rav Hirsch's justification for putting it in such a deeply religious sphere, is that the pasuk that discusses this in Vayikra is the same one that calls upon us to love our fellow as ourselves, Ki Ani Hashem, because of that divine seal that God is the Father of all. And when we are called upon not to bear a grudge, the justification of, because it is my people, God's people, my brethren, meaning a lot of weight is put onto the justification. The reason, from Rav Hirsch's standpoint, is because this idea of asking us not to bear a grudge is asking us to give up or perform a most difficult sacrifice. That is giving a recognition to the difficulty of what is being asked of us. To simply say, don't bear a grudge is a religious expectation. It's a mitzvah. Don't bear a grudge. That is such a shallow way of expressing such a deep and complex emotion. When someone bears a grudge, they don't do it willy-nilly. They don't just do it off the cuff. They've experienced the malevolence of humanity. When we bear a grudge, it's a form of a reply to a betrayal. What do I mean by that? When someone wrongs us, we think they did it intentionally. We don't think they did it by mistake. Then we wouldn't bear a grudge. We think they did it intentionally. We opened ourselves up to them in some way. We exposed our vulnerability in some way. We went to them for advice. We went to them asking. And Rav Hirsch brings the example from the Gemara that discusses when a person asks for a loan. The person's vulnerable. The person's opened himself up, put himself to an extent at the mercy of the other, and the other refused. The other looked at the person, saw his vulnerability, had the means to alleviate it, and said no. And Rav Hirsch continues, what is bearing a grudge and revenge? Is remembering when that person comes to you and using that same description of an event, they then come to you asking for a loan, and you remind them. You remind them of why you're not giving it to them. Now, this sounds dark, but that's what resentment is. Resentment is, in a way, justified. It requires a heavy weight on the side of the Torah to explain to us that this isn't what is expected of us. We are supposed to become greater. The religious calling isn't an easy calling, but Rav Hirsch gives it its due weight. And he explains beautifully from a psychological standpoint, and don't deceive yourself in thinking that it's easy. It's not easy. Because if we let it stay, and we say, yes, I forgive, I don't bear a grudge anymore, and we allow it to linger there, it festers, and it gets bigger, unless we are able to take an active stand against our resentment, the realness, and in a way the justification we have for resentment will fester. And these things turn into generational feuds. These things continue past our deaths. Because, once again, it's justified. How can something pass on for generations? Because you really hit something core. When you are betrayed, it is one of the darkest experiences. So, to recap this first point, Rav Hirsch gives it its due weight, recognizes what it means to bear a grudge. It's something that we truly experience, and we are being called upon to sacrifice that. To sacrifice that idea, that emotion, that resentment. We are called upon to look at it and put it to one side. The justification is religious, because we believe we're children of God. We believe that the same God that called upon us to love our neighbor is calling upon us to not bear a grudge. They are based in the same pasuk. It's an idea that people love to talk about. The maxim, love your neighbor like yourself. But just before that, the harder calling is, don't bear a grudge. And how to do this is no easier. How to do this is with the character trait of humility. Rav Hirsch brings in the idea of humility and describes it as a way of looking at yourself in the world. You look at yourself as given to the world, not the world given to you. That comes back to the core characteristic of Jewish ethics, of mission. We have a duty, we have a responsibility, and if we can acknowledge that and imbue that into our very being, not bearing a grudge becomes easier, because you look at yourself as being on a mission. The world, your property, your experience is part of your mission, and when someone wrongs you, you're able to let go of that, step in, recognize that somehow this was part of my mission, somehow this was a calling that I had to experience, and move on. Things aren't random, and these ideas flow through to each other. My job isn't to be the other individual. My job is to do my duty, to go on my mission. That is what humility is. Humility is to recognize my existence in this world is a mission and a responsibility. That is humility. That is the calling of the Jew. And that allows us to be, as Rav Hirsch calls it, the chassid, not as in Eastern European chassidus, a chassid in the truest sense of the word, the righteous person who is able to experience the pain and sacrifice it, and not bear a grudge, stand in there and let it pass. So on the one hand, we spoke about the gravitas of this calling and the religious justification that is needed to pass it through. And then we spoke about the key that allows us to do this expectation, and that is anava, that is humility. Both truly profound callings. One, to look at yourself in the world as being given, not it being given to you. And secondly, we are asked to give up on this resentment in the religious context. Not only religious because it's been called upon us by God, but also because we're talking about our own people, so it already has a heavier smack in the face. We're not talking about when some random disconnected person wrongs us. We're talking about someone from within our own people. In the religious context of where you expect people to do better. When you are being wronged by someone who you know knows better. This isn't an easy calling when a bad, evil person wrongs you. No, we are called upon to be able to stand in there, experience the wrong by someone of our own people who we know knows better, and to be able to not bear a grudge. And Rav Hirsch emphasizes the difficulty of this sacrifice, but also the cure or the immunization that can allow us to do this, and that is humility. Thank you very much for listening. Have a wonderful week.